This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Hanem.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, this is the 1-year anniversary of the genocide and destruction of Gaza and historic Palestine. We are on the precipice of continued ongoing genocide and disaster. Close to 43,000 Palestinians have been murdered, hundreds of thousands have been injured, and the starvation among Palestinian men, women, and children is expanding with no end in sight. In addition, the extension of the war in Gaza, including a ground invasion by the Israeli military into Lebanon and bombing into central Beirut, continues unchecked. And just in the last 24 hours, Jamal, a missile was fired from the Israeli military into a schoolyard in Gaza, killing men, women, and children, civilians. It's a gruesome 1-year anniversary. We're going to be covering all of that today, in addition to the internal exchanges between senior Biden administration officials, showing that early on in the war, many warnings were issued to both Biden and Blinken that Israel was committing war crimes and basically deliberately starving Palestinian children. More women and children have been killed in Gaza and Israel in the recent conflict than in a single year in the history of armed conflict. This is according to Oxfam. We'll be covering that, as well as giving updates of the ongoing destruction in Lebanon and Gaza. But before we get to that, Jamal, we're going to watch an interview with Dr. Rania Masri. She's the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network co-director and organizing and policy. She's going to discuss the recent attacks in Lebanon and Gaza. She's a supporter of Jill Stein, and she actually believes, Jamal, that Kamala Harris is much worse for world peace than Donald Trump. It's a great interview.
That's right, Jess. And of course, she reports on Lebanon and what's going on from, of course, what Israel is trying to do, which is basically another genocide, replicate the genocide in Gaza there, and the health and environmental impact there. Let's watch Dr. Rania Masri. Israel's mass-scale bombing of Lebanon over the last few weeks has killed at least 2,000 people, including 127 children and 261 women, and the numbers are going up. More than 1.2 million people have been displaced, and Israel's recent most massive assault on the densely populated suburbs of Beirut also targeted the border crossing with Syria, cutting off a road that was being used by hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Israeli bombardments. Many believe that Israel is reenacting its genocide from Gaza, where it has openly adopted attacks on healthcare as a military practice, violating international law. It is now targeting health centers and hospitals in Lebanon and has killed at least 50 paramedics over the last 2 weeks alone. Netanyahu and his surrogates state that this is an opportunity to reshape the Middle East in a way that might never again be possible, and the Biden administration only continues to support it. However, the people of Lebanon stand united against Israel's brutal aggression. Hezbollah forces continue to thwart Israel's ground incursion, and Iran's measured retaliation against Israeli military targets demonstrate that they support Lebanon and will not submit. Joining us on Arab Talk to talk about this currently besieged state of Lebanon and its people is Dr. Rania Masri. She is North Carolina's Environmental Justice Network's co-director of organizing and policy. She has been an activist and an organizer since 1993 and a professor and researcher since 2005 when she moved to Lebanon. She has taught interdisciplinary environmental sciences, environmental justice, and communications at the University of Balmain, the American University of Beirut, and the Lebanese American University, respectively. She served as an expert in the Court of Conscience, during which she presented testimony on the environmental impact of the 2006 Israeli war on Lebanon. Welcome back to Arab Talk, Rania.
Thank you for having me.
At this point, people in Lebanon appear united against Israel's aggression, working to feed and shelter displaced people in whatever way they can. Do you think that they realize that Israel is out to destroy and or occupy Lebanon, regardless of sectarian or religious affiliation?
Well, so is your question, do the Lebanese realize Israeli objectives? Yes, the vast majority of Lebanese do realize Israelis' objectives, which are expansionist. Already there have been images shared in occupied Palestine of Israelis planning for real estate development in Lebanon. There is a tweet that has been distributed of an Israeli father talking in Hebrew to his son, in which they're reading a book called Lebanon, in which the father is telling his son about how they will live their lives in Lebanon as settlers. So yes, the vast majority of Lebanese do understand Israeli expansionist aims, particularly because this is not the first Israeli aggression against Lebanon. The very first Israeli massacre against Lebanese was in 1948, a massacre against Hula on the borders with occupied Palestine. And Israel has maintained a slew of aggression since then. Now Israel is beginning its fourth invasion of Lebanon, which I am sure, with absolutely no doubt, Israel will be defeated in its invasion, like it was defeated in 2006 and like it fled in May 2000 itself.
With Israel killing paramedics, doctors, and medical staff and bombing hospitals, and if Israel proceeds with a full-fledged invasion, what will be the scene on the ground as far as displacement and health conditions?
Well, those are two factors. One, with regards to healthcare workers, yes, most definitely. Israel is trying to implement in Lebanon the horrors that it is continuing to implement in Gaza, with the attack of hospitals, the attack of ambulances, the attack of healthcare workers. Combined, both in occupied Palestine and in Lebanon, Israel has killed more than 1,000 healthcare workers. So yes, that is ongoing. But I do not see that as being tied to Israel's invasion, because thus far, since the moment that Israel has tried to invade Lebanon on the ground, they have been thwarted by the Hezbollah resistance. So I do not envision greater Lebanese displacement from an Israeli invasion, because thus far the Israeli invasion has not been militarily successful according to Israeli objectives. However, already we have 22% of the Lebanese population is displaced, with more than 87% of those displaced not having shelter and not having support. Will the displacement continue irrespective of the Israeli invasion on the ground in Lebanon? Yes, because Israeli bombardments are continuing, both in Dahi, in the southern suburbs of Beirut, in other parts of Beirut. Yesterday, they went as far north as hitting a Palestinian refugee camp in Tripoli. So we are talking about displacement of Lebanese throughout Lebanon. Of course, the vast majority of them are coming from southern Lebanon, are coming from the southern suburbs of Beirut, and are also coming from Baalbek in central Lebanon. So what I'm saying is displacement will continue to increase so long as the Israeli war machine is attacking us. But the Israeli invasion itself is being thwarted in an amazingly powerful fashion by the Hezbollah men.
Very few people talk about the environmental impact, and we've seen that in Gaza. I mean, it's devastating. I mean, and all these bombings, regardless, let's say, if they don't succeed in invasion, but all this bombing in Beirut and its suburbs and elsewhere, using phosphorus bombs and other missiles, and it's leaving a major environmental impact there, and you've had experience in this in the past. I mean, how devastating is this?
Well, let's examine how we would study the devastation. We look at the weapons that are used and their impacts on the environment, and then we look at what has been destroyed and the destruction's impact on the environment. So not only when we look at the weapons have we had Israel use white phosphorus, again in Beirut, they used white phosphorus in Beirut against healthcare workers. White phosphorus, which of course is extremely dangerous, it continues to burn the human skin until it reaches bone, huge ramifications. But a greater environmental danger is the bunker buster bombs that Israel has been using, the 2,000 to 4,000 pound bunker buster bombs. These are made in the United States. And when we examine the patent of these bombs, because Israel used them previously in 2006, a war that I lived through in Lebanon. And I remember when they were using them, I went through and looked at that patent of these bombs. And in that patent, it says that they are manufactured using either depleted uranium or tungsten. Now, tungsten is way more expensive than depleted uranium, so the likelihood that the Israelis would use tungsten is very small. The likelihood that they use depleted uranium is very high. Depleted uranium, as we know from when the United States used it in Iraq and in Afghanistan, is an extremely problematic element, extremely problematic. It is born from the nuclear enrichment process, so it's almost like nuclear power, almost. It is not radioactive, but it is born of that process. It has untold consequences on our soil, on our water, on our animals. And we know for a fact, based on its exposure in Iraq, that it definitely increases the spread of cancer, particularly stomach cancer and birth defects. And these now have been used in Dahi, in the southern suburbs, enormous amounts. And let us remember, Israel also used them against tents in Gaza. They used bunker buster bombs against tents in Gaza. Thus far, we know since October 2023 until now, the United States, the beacon of democracy in the so-called free world, the United States has sent more than 50,000 tons of weaponry to Israel. And Israel continues to run out of ammunition. So we can imagine how much tonnage of weaponry has been used against Palestinians in Gaza and against people in Lebanon. And again, their environmental consequences are really, really quite significant. And here we're not even talking about the bombing of sewage infrastructure, the bombing of factories and the exposure of chemicals that arises from the bombing of factories, the bombing of homes that were built before the 1970s. And thus these are homes that has asbestos in their ceiling. And now we're talking about exposure of asbestos in the air, and on and on and on. The environmental consequences are huge.
And the pollution to aquifers, water aquifers.
Yes.
And we've seen that in Gaza, we've seen that in Iraq, and it takes years to get rid of it. It's not like something like you could just get rid of it overnight.
No, and when it comes to depleted uranium, we don't know how to get rid of it. We don't know how. The United States doesn't know how, and it is extremely expensive. And let us keep in mind that Lebanon is bankrupt. Lebanon declared financial and economic bankruptcy back in 2019. So we don't have the financial means to clean up, nor do we have a functioning government that would even have the policy to clean up. So yes, the environmental consequences are quite severe. And of course, there's an additional cost, which is what do we do with all the rubble of all these homes that are being destroyed, all this infrastructure that is being destroyed? And there's also all the damage that we're seeing in Lebanon, all the horrors that the Israelis are imposing on Lebanon with the U.S. blessing. They are continuing to impose these horrors against our families and our brethren in Gaza.
Israel claims it is attacking Lebanon to rout out Hezbollah, and it has assassinated many of its upper echelons of leadership. Explain the significance and the role that Hezbollah has played in defending Lebanon historically, and how much support it has in the country at large. And this being said, how important was Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah to the people's morale, and how heavy a blow was his assassination?
Before I talk about Hezbollah, I do want to affirm that Hezbollah, as well as the Yemenis, as well as the Iraqis, and most recently the Iranians, they are actually fulfilling their obligations according to the Genocide Convention by working to stop the ongoing genocide in Gaza. It is the rest of the world, with the exception of South Africa and Spain, that have fallen silent and are either actively supporting the genocide or silently supporting the genocide. So with regards to legality, Hezbollah has been behaving, and always with extreme respect to international law and fulfilling its obligations. As to the loss of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, it is a huge loss that one cannot diminish. It is a loss that is felt not simply within Hezbollah, but I would argue that has been felt by people who believe in liberation around the world, from South Africa to Indonesia to, of course, the heartbeat of the Arab world, which is Palestine. We have all felt his loss greatly. Now, how much has his loss impacted the functioning of Hezbollah? I would argue the opposite. That having Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah become a martyr has actually inflamed the fighters even more than they were before. We know that in an ambush that they did several days ago, earlier this week, where they lay in wait for the invading Israeli soldiers for almost 24 hours, and then they attacked them in the ambush, and they screamed out, Labbayku Nasrullah. And they managed an extremely successful ambush, extremely successful. So when we look at the military workings of Hezbollah, we have not seen on the ground that they have been diminished with the loss of the great leader, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. And yes, I forgot to answer the other part of your question. Hezbollah's role in Lebanon's liberation cannot be in any way diminished. Hezbollah was born out of the Israeli occupation of the South, an occupation that began in 1978. Hezbollah was born in 1983. Hezbollah was born from that occupation and led the resistance against that occupation alongside others such as the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, the Lebanese Communist Party, numerous Palestinian factions, including the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They all worked under Hezbollah's, of course, leadership to liberate all of the South, with the exception of the Shebaa farms, which remain under occupation, from 1983 until May 2000. So Hezbollah played a magnificent role in the liberation of the country. Hezbollah also played a magnificent role in 2006 in showing Israel that it cannot militarily invade Lebanon without getting extreme consequences. And of course, there's the other liberation of Lebanon, which is the liberation of Lebanon from ISIS, because ISIS had invaded and occupied almost 20% of Lebanon's territory. And it was Hezbollah alone that was fighting ISIS in Lebanese territory and managed to liberate our lands from ISIS.
It's been shocking, though, to see how easily it was for Israel to assassinate most of the top leadership of Hezbollah. Did this surprise you? Is Lebanon infiltrated with spies and collaborators?
Lebanon is most definitely infiltrated with spies. There's no question. Now, how much have those spies been able to infiltrate Hezbollah structure? I don't know. And I would not want to make any assumptions or accusations on that front. We do know that the abilities for Israel to conduct espionage against Lebanese, as well as around the world, is quite superior. They have technological superiority with regards to their espionage. So perhaps they were able, through their technology, to infiltrate certain avenues. But again, with regards to collaborators, I have no evidence and I would not speak on that. With regards to espionage, unfortunately, Lebanon is riddled with spies, most definitely including the fortress of the U.S. Embassy in central Lebanon.
However, Israel is not strategically targeting Hezbollah. It's been completely indiscriminate with the terrorist pager attacks, bunker buster bombs in very densely inhabited city blocks. Are we seeing a reenactment of the genocide in Gaza?
Yes, we are. We are seeing also the Dahi doctrine taken to a whole other extreme. And we are seeing Israel prove itself that because it is incapable of attacking military targets, because it is incapable of fighting face-to-face with fighters on the ground, Israel does what it knows how to do, which is kill people. We saw that exemplified by the way that the Israelis talked about the Iranian strike. The Iranian military strike against Israel in response to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh within Israel, and of course the assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, the Iranian strike against Israel was extraordinarily successful. 90% of the strike reached their targets. Their targets were solely military facilities. They managed to destroy half of Israel's F-35 fighter jets, and they attacked 4 military targets within Israel. Israel responded by saying the Iranian strike was unsuccessful because no Israelis were killed. So according to Israel, their metric for success is the death of people. But according to a military battlefield, that is not the metrics of success of a military war. That is the metrics of success of genocide. So yes, Israel is taking what they have done against Palestinians in Gaza and placing it against Lebanese in Lebanon. But just like as in Gaza, where they have been unable to stop the military resistance of Hamas, where 75% of Hamas's military centers remain active despite 1 year of a genocide, Israel will face that same military failure in Lebanon. The question for all of us is, how long are we going to continue to be part of a system in the United States that continues to fund and normalize the mass murder and genocide of Lebanese and Palestinians? How long will so many of us, not just as Arab Americans, but so many so-called liberals and others, continue to bend over backwards to whitewash the crimes of the Biden-Harris administration, or to attempt to forgive the ongoing genocide by saying, yes, but they will vote for Kamala Harris? That has to stop. When we say genocide is a red line, we should mean it is a red line and therefore unforgivable, period. So we need to be unequivocal in saying we will not, under any circumstances, vote for Kamala Harris.
Well, I was going to ask about this question later on, but since we went there, what do you think about some organizations, Muslim American organizations like Engage?
Engage has a long history of working with Zionists.
Endorsing, despite all these calls, by Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, and now, last minute, I'm talking last minute, like a month before the elections or less than that, they are issuing press releases endorsing Kamala Harris.
In Arabic, we would say, قُلْ مَنْ تُعَاشِرْ أَقُلْ مَنْ أَنْتَ. Engage, when we see who they interact with, we realize who they are. Engage was uncovered by the electronic intifada several years ago as normalizing with Zionist. And so it comes as no surprise, of course, that they would want to be in bed with the biggest Zionist the U.S. has ever known. The Biden-Harris administration is the most pro-Israeli administration this country has ever known. So in that sense, Engage is remaining true to its own principles of normalizing and supporting Zionism. And if you notice the other list of Muslim Americans that was thrown in there, I don't believe there's any Arab amongst them. And it reeks to me of the same kind of support that Barack Obama got, or the same kind of support that people now are giving to Kamala Harris. Oh, she's a woman. Oh, she's a person of color. Oh, therefore we must support her. This is hogwash. We support politicians based on their policies. And if we look at the policies of Kamala Harris, we see the policies of someone who supports and normalizes genocide, and also the policies of someone within the United States who is endorsed by the war criminal Dick Cheney. So on both avenues, she is horrendous, domestically horrendous, and from a foreign policy perspective, completely horrendous. And Engage is simply unveiling its true colors by continuing to endorse Kamala Harris. Now, the other major Muslim organizations have stood firm, and actually we have seen major Muslim organizations calling out that they do not want any of their members to vote for neither Kamala Harris nor for Donald Trump, but are calling on their members to vote for third-party candidates. We also have the Muslim American PAC, MAPAC, that openly endorsed Jill Stein for president. So here again, Engage is the exception to the voice of Muslim Americans and not the norm.
The Biden-Harris administration has thrown, of course, its support behind Israel during its genocide in Gaza, ignored calls for ceasefire, and provided Israel with cover at the United Nations. It provided Israel with deadly bombs and missiles to slaughter Palestinians, despite all the demonstrations, the hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating on college campuses and elsewhere in the United States. The Secretary Blinken lied about aid being delivered to Palestinians, and now both Biden and Harris are saying that they don't want to see an escalation of the war in Lebanon. And my question, I probably know the answer, but do you believe them, or any of the Lebanese public believes them?
I cannot speak to all Lebanese in the United States, but I think for any intelligent person in this country, listening to the Biden-Harris administration claiming that they want a ceasefire while continuing to send more than $30 billion worth of weaponry to Israel since October, clearly one would reach one of two conclusions. Either the Biden-Harris administration is completely idiotic and mentally impaired, or they are lying to the public. It would be one or the other. And when we actually look at their policies and look at what they're calling for, clearly they are in support of the Israeli state full force. And they're using the term ceasefire in a manner as to how numerous other US administrations use the term two-state solution and peace process. Those terms were used to create a blanket to cover Israeli crimes while Israel continued to expand its territories into the West Bank, into Jerusalem, while, we are working on a peace process. It's the same language that the Biden-Harris administration is using. And I think it's important to note what Harris's VP said during the VP debate. He said, and I quote, "The expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the U.S. to have the steady leadership there." The expansion of Israel, the expansion, they're using the term expansion. So of Israel to go beyond its borders is viewed by this administration as an absolute necessity. So clearly they don't want to ceasefire. Clearly they want to see further violations of both national laws and international laws. Clearly they want to see an expansion of apartheid, an expansion of the settler state colony. And all of these things will result in further retaliations from the resistance, both in Lebanon and in Palestine, and hopefully would get more support from Iraq and Yemen and Iran.
Well, during both the Israeli aggressions on Gaza and now Lebanon, Arab countries just paid lip service, except for the groups you've mentioned in Yemen and Iraq. The notion of a strong Arab front against Israeli aggression has dissipated.
Well, it dissipated a long time ago, though. It dissipated with the start of the Oslo Accords back in 1993, when the Oslo Accords officially allowed these so-called Arab governments to normalize with Israel. We knew that the United Arab Emirates was participating in military attacks against Gaza back in 2018. So when we look at those Arab countries, it's very important to note that not one of them is a democracy. Not one of them can claim to represent the will of its population. And there is a reason why U.S. military bases are spread throughout that region. The U.S. military props up those dictators and works with them to silence opposition domestically against their policies. All the while, you have those same dictators that are propped up by the U.S. military continuing to purchase weapons from the U.S. military. So we have U.S. satellites there. So unfortunately, they are traitors, they are dictators, they are not representative of the Arab people, and very sadly that they are collaborators in the crime against Palestinians and Lebanese. And Syrians, let us not forget that Israel has also been bombing Damascus and the Golan Heights.
Well, there are some voices in Lebanon who criticize, of course, Hezbollah for receiving weapons from Iran and Iran's involvement in Lebanon. And now, both Palestinians and Lebanese feel being totally abandoned by the Arab world. We've seen just like a day ago, a defiant, I would say, Iranian foreign minister of Iran, Abbas Araghchi, who flew into Beirut despite threats from Israel in an Iranian military plane.
Yes.
How significant is this?
It further unveils the hypocrisy of the Arabs, of so many of the Arab governments. And here let's name them. We would include Jordan and Egypt, most definitely, and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. These are the leaders in normalizing and in working with the Israeli state, the main leaders behind this. So yes, they are being further unveiled. And we are showing, actually, it's been clarified what is the axis of resistance against the axis of evil, and who is supporting the axis of evil, which unfortunately extends beyond the United States and Israel, because this axis of evil, this axis of genocide, is also supported by Germany, also supported by the UK, also supported by France, and now also supported by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan, who these Arab countries are trying to claim neutrality in this horrendous aspect. There is no space for neutrality amidst a genocide. There is no space for that. So yes, most definitely that is happening. But I would argue that none of us are surprised by it, because not once did we see these Arab governments that I have spoke about, not once did they send one soldier to liberate our lands. Nizar Qabbani, the brilliant Syrian poet, wrote decades ago that they have not sent one soldier to liberate Jerusalem. And this was back in the 70s. So we're not surprised by the acquiescence and the horrendous acts that are coming from these governments. We never expected support from them. But it is beautiful and amazing and inspirational to see Yemen, which has been under attack for years by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and the United States, to continue to protest in the millions and to give up their blood in the manner that they're doing, and to strategically be impacting the flow of weapons to Israel by their blockade of the Red Sea. I mean, it is absolutely beautiful. So all of us around the world need to get inspiration from Yemen, as well as constant inspiration from the Palestinian and Lebanese fighters who are still being victorious in the battlefields.
Are you optimistic about what you've been seeing right here in the United States from the students and the youth and the minorities who have been marching for basically a year now, calling for a ceasefire and stopping sending weapons to Israel? I mean, this has not stopped, despite, of course, their cause have been falling on deaf ears within the administration. I mean, we're seeing an organic global movement, not just only in the United States, but in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, do you feel that this is going to create change in the future?
I find the student movement to be beautiful, to be organic, to be courageous. But if it continues in the manner that it has continued for the past few months, which we saw at the beginning of this semester, how the universities came back with greater repression against students, greater restrictions against students. Now the students that worked to build those encampments, that they were beautiful over the spring semester, they're going to have extreme more difficulty, and they have been facing serious difficulty on campuses to organize. I think we need to be strategic, and we need to be targeting the ports throughout the country that, from those places, we have the military weapons being sent to. It is very sad that we have a beautiful strike by the longshoremen throughout the east coast of the United States, but in this strike, they are excluding military cargo rather than including military cargo in their strike. So I am inspired by the students, but it is not enough. And I think right now, between now and November, our main target should be to make sure that Kamala Harris does not win the presidency. And I say this here as a socialist, I say this as an organizer, that if we look at fascism within the United States, it will increase under a democratic leadership, particularly when that democratic leadership is Kamala Harris. And repression against us all, domestically and internationally, will increase if Kamala Harris gets reelected and interprets that to be, they have forgiven me genocide. So that should be our first objective. And then in November, we then organize to stop the shipment of weapons. We organize to divest our city councils, our counties, our universities, our churches, our mosques, everything from weapons bonds and Israel bonds. And we continue to build the struggle forward.
Well, what's your answer to those who accuse you? I'm not saying you personally, but accuse people who are saying what you're saying, that they are spoilers and you'll be electing Donald Trump.
I say elect Donald Trump. Let me be very specific. When I say I do not want Kamala Harris to win, I understand that Jill Stein will likely not win the presidency, and Jill Stein is my choice. Donald Trump as a president will be less destructive to the United States and less destructive to the world than Kamala Harris. And if we look at the policies that Trump imposed on the United States in his 4 years, we look at the number of people that were killed through his foreign policy, and we compare them to Barack Obama and compare them to Biden, they are significantly less. So anyone who is more scared of Donald Trump than Kamala Harris is saying two things. One, they're saying that our lives as Arabs are lesser than their potential loss of comfort in the United States. And they need to claim that. They need to recognize that anyone who votes for Kamala Harris and is scared of Donald Trump is saying it is okay to kill 300,000 Palestinians in Gaza. And it is okay to regard Israel as an expansionist country that must be supported by the United States. They are saying okay to that real crime, one. Two, they are being tremendously ignorant of who is actually endorsing Kamala Harris And I am tired of forgiving people's ignorance. We look at Project 2025, which is what liberals scare us with Donald Trump. Project 2025, the writers of that project have endorsed Kamala Harris. Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney have openly said they endorse Kamala Harris because they like her foreign policy. Have we forgotten who Dick Cheney is and what policies he imposed? We look at the immigration. Everybody's like, oh, but immigration. Joseph Biden has been more stringent on the border than Donald Trump wanted to be. And Kamala Harris is promising 1,500 more ICE agents on the border. We look at the economic policy. Kamala Harris is endorsed by Wall Street, and Donald Trump is not endorsed by Wall Street. Kamala Harris is endorsed by the brutality of the police departments that she wants to increase. Donald Trump is not. So on what level are they more scared of Donald Trump, even if they forget our lives and our families who have been butchered and shredded to pieces in Palestine and Lebanon? Even if they want to be racist against us, let them at least be aware of what is coming. We can also look at the mere fact that when there is a Democrat in office as the president, Democrats in Congress fall in line and support their genocidal warmongering policies. But when you have that same policy introduced by a Republican, then Democrats stand up against it. So I urge everyone who is voting for Kamala Harris out of fear of Donald Trump to wake up and read the policy and wake up and read the history and wake up and recognize what they are saying to liberation movements in the United States and around the world when they forgive genocide. So yes, I am very aware of what I am saying. Yes, I am very aware that in North Carolina, in the swing state of North Carolina, when I go to vote for Jill Stein, I am doing that with the full awareness that I very much hope Donald Trump wins the state of North Carolina and not Kamala Harris. Of course, what I really want Americans to recognize that if they claim to live in a democracy, then let them vote according to that democracy. The vast majority of Americans want a ceasefire. The vast majority of Americans do not want the support of Israel through this blanket arms support. The vast majority of Americans want healthcare, want environmental protection. And yet they don't have the courage to vote for the only candidate that is available on the ballot in the vast majority of the country. They don't have the courage to vote for her because they are scared. They are voting out of fear again. For how many 4-year cycles are we going to continue to vote out of fear and then act surprised when we have an evil president, when they continue to claim they're voting for the lesser evil? So, I mean, I am angry at these claims presented by people who claim to be literate and who claim to know their history. So they're either ignorant or they are racist. It is really simple.
Dr. Rania Masri, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jamal.
That's the voice in the face of Dr. Rania Masri. She's the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network's co-director of organizing and policy. Jamal, Rania gives us a very kind of disturbing picture, not only of the destruction of infrastructure within Lebanon, but the profound environmental impacts. And what is clear that there's going to be yet another emerging genocide occurring in Lebanon that is already happening in Gaza. This is a very disturbing and sobering development. And by the way, 100 medical personnel have been killed since Israel started to invade and destroy the south of Lebanon as well as Beirut. A recent bomb attack actually was right next to one of the main hospitals in Beirut, forcing the hospital to close and injuring and killing hundreds of people. It's another attack on the healthcare infrastructure, Jamal. It seems like the war crimes that Israel is doing are going unchecked in the world community as we approach the 1-year anniversary of the genocide.
That's right. Moving on to our next story, Jess. Several senior U.S. officials warned the Biden administration about possible Israeli war crimes. According to a report by Reuters revealing multiple exchanges between top Biden officials, Diana Straul, the then Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, wrote an email on the 13th of October to senior Biden aides saying that Israel's call for the forced displacement of Palestinians in northern Gaza would violate international law. The email from Straul came out of a conversation she had with the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. Brett McGurk responded to the email saying the U.S. might be able to convince Israel to extend its deadline for Palestinians to be displaced, but the ICRC and other aid agencies should prepare for it. That's like one of the messages. We cannot go over all the messages, Jess. Another message was from Paula Tufro, a senior White House official in charge of humanitarian response, who wrote that there is simply no way to have this scale of displacement without creating a humanitarian catastrophe. Another message from Christopher Lemont, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State's Department Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, DRL, recommended that Washington deny Israel more than a dozen arms packages. That's when the Biden administration was like denied Israel a few bombs here and there.
Right.
Le Monde was concerned about specific Israeli police units, including the Imam Patrol Unit, which was basically massacring civilians. 16 different, the State Department, DRL, objected to 16 different arms packages for Israel, and so on. We can go on and go on. All fell on deaf ears in the Biden administration.
Right, but you're saying it fell on deaf ears. I don't think the ears were deaf, Jamal. I think rather the Biden administration and Kamala Harris and Antony Blinken and certain segments within the State Department and the inner security apparatus within the Biden administration knew this, understood it completely and fully, and decided to go full steam ahead, Jamal, with supplying more arms, more weapons, more intelligence information, and not only just cover, but support for the genocide and destruction of human lives and infrastructure in Gaza. And now, Jamal, I think we can comfortably say, despite all the hand-wringing that we're seeing from President Biden and Kamala Harris, that they're continuing the same kind of support for Israel with its devastation in Lebanon. I mean, you and I have been talking about this for a long time, in the last year. But this report from Reuters supports and provides the background evidence that the Biden administration knowingly participated in this genocide. I mean, in some ways, Jamal, is anybody really surprised that the Biden administration actively participated in this genocidal attack on Palestinians and now Lebanese? Are you really that surprised?
Well, not only they participated in this and supplied Israel with 4,000 pounds bombs and so forth.
Right.
But also they obstructed resolutions at the United Nations.
Exactly.
Calls for ceasefire. They ignored the hundreds of thousands of Americans demonstrating in the streets calling for ceasefire.
Yeah.
More importantly, they stood in the way of the United Nations as UN workers were getting killed. In fact, today, just the head of UNRWA on the ground. You remember last week we had a guest from the communications director for UNRWA on the show, and today their director on the ground in Gaza was killed.
Right.
That's right. Because in the last interview, one of their employees was killed in Lebanon, but today is like the main person on the ground in Gaza was killed. And so the United States ignored all these calls, obstructed calls for ceasefire. And in fact, part of the discussions here of the some of the, I would say, employees at the State Department with good conscience who were making these warnings and assessment was also partly because they did not want the United States to be dragged into the International Court of Justice. Of course, it's not a signatory to that, but to be named along with Israel for war crimes. And the Biden administration totally ignored it.
Well, I think this is part of the story that will unfold over the next number of months and years. When the history books are written, this will not just be the Israeli genocide of Gaza and Lebanon, Jamal. It will be the Israeli-American genocide. And we can expect that the International Court of Justice, the ICC, and maybe other international bodies will finally be able to, implicate directly in their filings the role of the Biden, Blinken, Harris administration. I just want to point out a few other things, Jamal, that are really critical. Not only did the Biden administration knowingly participate in this genocide and did nothing and obstructed, as you said, at the United Nations, let's not forget, despite all the hand-wringing by Biden and Harris and Blinken, the more painful reality for Palestinians, especially children in Gaza right now, they're starving to death still. And there's no increase whatsoever of the amount of food and medical aid that is getting into Gaza right now. So the imminent starvation that is affecting close to 500,000 Palestinian children remains active. Polio is not fully under control. And we're getting into the winter season, Jamal, where, the flu and COVID and all these other infectious diseases are going to run rampant again, and there's no vaccinations in Gaza. This is not just a humanitarian crisis. It's a medical crisis. It's a health crisis. And every time we see Biden and Blinken wringing their hands about how, they're trying to stop Netanyahu, it's obviously bogus. It's obviously rubbish. This is part of the American policy. We want our listeners and viewers to really understand there is no daylight between the United States and the Israeli genocide. There isn't. And we need to keep hammering that home as we are in the 1-year anniversary, Jamal.
And this is a segue to our next story, Jess.
Yeah.
And this is a report from Oxfam.
Yeah.
Which says more women and children have been killed in Gaza by the Israeli military over the past year than the equivalent period of any other conflict over the past 2 decades.
It's disturbing.
That. Conservative figures show that more than 6,000 women and 11,000 children were killed in Gaza by the Israeli military over the last 12 months. Data from 2004 to 2021 on direct conflict deaths from the Small Arms Survey estimates that the highest number of women killed in a single year was over 2,600 in Iraq. That was in Iraq, of course, in 2016. I mean, these are staggering, both staggering and appalling and heartbreaking, I would say, figures, Jess.
Yeah, but here's the thing, Jamal. What is the world doing about it? I mean, we have been reporting on statistics and casualties and starvation and all of these things, for the year now, and actually longer than the year, because as you and I know and have been reporting on for decades now, the devastation in historic Palestine, Gaza, West Bank, in Jerusalem has been going on for 76 years. It's just the amplification in this last year has been so gruesome and so depraved. And we're faced with this reality that the Israeli genocide, Jamal, and the inability of the world community to hold Israel accountable is leading the entire world to the brink of a destruction of the world order. There's no world order anymore, Jamal. People really perceive what Israel is doing as a breakdown of the world order, where these kinds of things should not be happening, that people come together, countries come together to try to hold these depraved actions that Israel is engaged in, hold them accountable. But none of that is happening, none whatsoever. And I think you and I both have this kind of, horrible sense in the pit of our stomachs that as we acknowledge the 1-year anniversary of the genocide, it looks like this is going to get worse, because Israel announced today that it's encircling various communities in Gaza right now. There's a ground invasion in Lebanon right now. Beirut is under attack, and they're getting ready to bomb Iran, Jamal. So this is a very, very problematic moment historically that we're in right now.
Well, I want to comment also on this report, which included figures from Action on Armed Violence, and these figures, separate data basically, goes up to the September 2023. it shows that Israel hit civilian infrastructure across Gaza with explosive weapons once every 3 hours on an average since the war began. Once every 3 hours. And it goes on, to give other data, just to give the magnitude of this violence and this genocide, basically. And Israel hit infrastructure, everything with explosive weapons, meaning missiles and bombs, homes every 4 hours, tents and temporary shelters every 17 hours, schools and hospitals every 4 days, aid distribution points and warehouses every 15 days. They go on. They just give you, they've documented. This is the thing. This is the most probably documented human rights violation and genocide. Even if you go all the way back to the Holocaust, you did not have this documentation because you did not have the resources and you did not have the technology to do that. But this is documented. It's presented by different United Nations agencies and other agencies. You could go to the United Nations Children Armed Conflict Reports, and you could go to other ones that give you all these records on how many people died, how did they die, what type of bombs were used, how frequent were they attacked, whether it was by air or by land and so forth. And yet, this is ongoing, and the Biden administration pretends it's doing something. Oh, yeah, we're talking to them. Oh, yeah, we're trying to do something. We're now, after 10 months, we're calling for a ceasefire. But Benjamin Netanyahu is not listening. And then they repeat time and time again that Israel has the right to defend itself. There was an interview this morning, I think on CBS 60 Minutes with Kamala Harris about Lebanon. And the same thing she said, Israel has the right to defend itself. They have to, they've been attacked by Hamas. They've been attacked by Hezbollah. Nothing about the suffering of children or women or civilians.
Or nothing about international law, Jamal, because, Harris is holding herself out to be this prosecutor, this, attorney, this legal expert who believes in international law and domestic law. It's really insulting and laughable because, Jamal, we're in October now. The October surprise may be in front of us. Kamala Harris is losing actually her honeymoon period after the debate, and everything is starting to wane. All the polls show a tightening of the race, and it's a coin flip right now. And some people are speculating that Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu, because they support Trump, may be part of this October surprise, where in fact they destabilize the region more. They're most likely going to hit Iran and hit the oil refineries, maybe even their nuclear project, and that will inflame the situation tenfold, as well as increase gas prices. And some people are speculating that could be the big October surprise that will follow Kamala Harris into the election.
Well, talking about surprises, you're absolutely correct. We don't know what's going to happen, to tell you the truth, because one day I hear that she's up in the polls, the other day she's down in the polls. What matters, as you know, is the swing states. 1 or 2 swing states can decide who's going to be the president of the United States, and we don't know what's going on. All that I know is people in your home state of Michigan are not going to vote for her.
They won't.
They had several votes, several polls, and each poll indicates that she's losing there, basically. And that's going to be an important factor. Now, having said that, we are, as we're speaking now, we might be on the verge of World War III because of the action and not action, also inaction of the Biden administration. Should Israel retaliates, now and hits Iran and hits the oil fields and refineries, forget about the nuclear facilities, because the Biden administration, that's what the Biden administration is concerned about. Don't hit the nuclear facilities. But if they hit the oil fields, expect Americans to stand in line for an hour to get some gasoline, and the price of oil is going to be about $10. And the Straits of Hormuz are going to be shut down, okay? And then you're going to get now the Russians drawn in, and possibly China will be drawn in, and we could go into World War III because of this basically inaction in the beginning of the war to stop the genocide on Gaza, which dragged on into Lebanon, and now it's going to drag on into Iran. And Iran's not going to sit on its hands. We saw its response, which is kind of interesting because the response was very accurate. They've hit 3 Israeli military bases. And the Biden administration, which has all the satellite images, we had to wait for a third party to provide satellite images that showed that those were direct hits. Yet they lied. They said, oh, nothing happened. We downed all these missiles and so forth.
Yeah, it's
missiles,
a joke.
Which is a joke, which basically Iran did not want to aim them at Tel Aviv, because if one of those missiles fell in downtown Tel Aviv, hundreds of people would have died. And they just aimed it at the military installations, which the United States warned Israel, like Iran's about to hit you. So, so you didn't have casualties, but you had planes, which was basically burned on the ground and so forth. Now, Iran is saying that if Israel attacks its oil fields, they're gonna there is no limit to their response. Okay? There'll be no limit to their response.
Yeah. Yeah. But here's the thing, Jamal. The lying, the disinformation coming from the Biden administration on this has been laughable. And you alluded to it, but it's a really important point. The New York Times, the Washington Post, all posting things about, these comments from the State Department and the security advisors of the Biden administration saying, as well as the Israelis, this was a nothing burger. Nothing happened. All these missiles came. It was ineffective and all these things. But the reality, and there was, a couple of reports that just came out this morning that you referenced, really showed significant damage to the Israeli military bases. These were significant, breaches of the Israeli, defense system, and this was just the tip of the iceberg. So, we'll see. I mean, we're hearing Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli military saying we're going to go after Iran. The United States is sending more assets, into basically territory that's going to put the U.S. military and Navy in harm's way, more bombing in Yemen, Jamal. And by the way, and I was hoping you would comment on this, some of the missiles and drones coming into Israeli airspace are actually coming from Iraq too. So not just Yemen, but also from Iraq. This is really a very, very dangerous moment that we're facing.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.